Very good morning to everyone. You all are welcome to the Sunday service and welcome to the Zoom. Today we are going to start the Sunday service with the meditation. Venerable Chandasala will lead the meditation first, and then Stephen Subodha, he will give the Dhamma talks. Chandasara, now you can lead the meditation session.
Thank you so much, Venerable Panyaloka. Now this is the time to generate positive energy by cultivating positive thoughts. First, we do breathing relaxation meditation, so that we just observe our breathing in and out as they naturally occur. We mindfully breathe in and mindfully breathe out, but we do not trust. We just naturally breathe in and out with mindfulness. Now, shall we start practicing breathing meditation for about 3 minutes before we cultivate loving kindness? Mindfully breathe in and out, observing how the breathing occurs naturally. I mindfully breathe out. I mindfully breathe in. When I am breathing in, I'm aware that I'm breathing in. When I'm breathing out, I am aware that I am breathing out. I mindfully observe inhalation and exhalation as they naturally occur. Now, shall we cultivate loving kindness thoughts to all the living beings, including ourselves? In this way, may all the living beings, including me, be physically well. May all the living beings, including me, be safe. May all the living beings, including me, be mentally well. Let's continue spreading loving kindness thoughts in this way for about 2 or 3 minutes. May all the living beings, including me, be physically well. May all the living beings, including me, be safe. May all the living beings, including me, be mentally well.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you so much, Venerable Chandasara, for leading the meditation session. Now it's time for us to start the Dhamma Talk, and I would like to invite our Kalyanamita, precious friend Stephen Subodha, to start his Dhamma Talk. Now it's all yours, Stephen Subodha.
Thank you, Bhante. I pay homage to the Buddha. I pay homage to the Dhamma. I pay homage to the Sangha. Before Bhante Shanti, our abbot, left for his trip to Sri Lanka that he's on currently, he was telling me about some of the locations, some of the temples, the monasteries that he helps oversee there in Sri Lanka. He was telling me of the various lands that these temples are on, and the various groves and fragrant flowers that grow there. And he described what sounded very beautiful to me. I was particularly entranced with the idea of basically a grove of cinnamon trees. You know, we usually don't think about how cinnamon comes from the bark of trees in Sri Lanka, and once the trees are big enough, they'll start harvesting some of the bark and turn that into the ground cinnamon that we enjoy in our food. And he was telling me how old some of these places are. One of the temples that he helps oversee is something like 1,500 years old. And I was amazed to hear that there was a temple that old that was still functioning today. You know, there was monastery grounds that still exist after so much time. You know, when you put it in perspective, that temple would have been founded roughly 1,100 years after the passing of the Buddha himself, or rather during the lifetime of the Buddha himself. And so here's this place that acts as sort of this point in history between the Buddha's lifetime and our present moment. That this temple is as ancient to us as the lifetime of the Buddha and the beginning of the Sangha would have been to the people who founded that temple. And it made me think about, you know, history and legacy and what that means for those of us practicing Buddhism today in the United States, which as a country is very young. And we don't have a whole lot of, let's say, buildings or monuments that themselves are thousands of years old. We have things that are maybe a couple centuries old tops. But that history, though short, is still significant, complicated and complex, but significant. And in that history is also the history of what is perhaps emerging as American Buddhism, whatever that's going to look like. You know, American Buddhism being the melting pot sort of scenario that a lot of things in America end up being. We have many traditions that exist here in IBMC. And so because of that, I started thinking of the history of IBMC itself. And it is recent history. This temple, this meditation center, was founded in 1970, which is still well within the lifetimes of people who are alive today, but not for me. You know, I was born in the 80s. So that means that the founder of this temple, the first abbot of this temple, Venerable Thich Thien An, is someone who for me is an historical figure. He's not someone I ever met. He's not someone I ever conversed with. He has existed for me as someone in pictures and in written word. I've never even heard a recording of his voice. And yet, despite all of that, I am in many ways indebted to his existence and the work that he has done to create this place, to create IBMC. And in terms of Buddhism and its history, I myself and anyone who is living here, residing here, and practicing here is a part of his legacy, let's say, what he's left behind. And so because of all that, I wanted to get to know him better, Venerable Thich. I wanted to perhaps understand what I might have learned had I been a student of his during his lifetime before he passed away in 1980. And so I ended up turning to this one book that had been sitting on my bookshelf for quite a while. This is the book Zen Philosophy and Zen Practice. Well, Zen Philosophy, Zen Practice, written by Venerable Thich. It was written in 1975. And so even this book is in its own way a kind of history, something that existed roughly a decade before I was born, and 5 years before Venerable Thich would pass away. And early on in my time coming to IBMC, I bought this book because I knew it was written by the founder of IBMC, and I thought, oh, it'd be good to have this. But because of the sort of ecumenical and international side of IBMC, I myself have never been, at least in my time here at IBMC, a practicer, let's say, a practitioner of Zen Buddhism. In my time here, I've been practicing Theravada Buddhism, specifically the forest tradition, what's known as a Kammatthana, the place of work, if we translate it from Pali, more or less. And that's the tradition that I come from and what I bring here into what I share at IBMC. So when I bought this, looked through it a few times and thought, oh, well, this is interesting, and sort of kept it as this, reminder of the founder of IBMC and its traditions, but then just left it on the bookshelf. So recently in looking through it, I at first was mostly just looking at it in terms of historical value, looking at the little bit of history on Zen itself, looking at a bit of history on Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, and looking at the photos. And the photos are actually very, for me, heartwarming, because they show a community that was very vibrant and very active. And in that same ecumenical sense, from the very beginning, Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh was bringing in people from multiple traditions. There are pictures of ordinations that happened right here where we're sitting that show him bringing in Mahayana monks and nuns and Theravada monks and having them converse and share in the Dhamma together. So it's pretty heartwarming. And then in going through the book itself and the actual contents of the lessons, some of the stuff are not things that I would agree with in my interpretation of Buddhism, not just in terms of Mahayana, but Zen and everything else, the sort of philosophical points. But I did notice that there were plenty of things that I did agree with, things that I thought were very important, in fact, things that were universal to all of Buddhism, I think, sort of like a pan-Buddhist thing that many of us could agree on, but also just deeply fundamental in terms of their importance. And one of those sections of the book that I wanted to focus on today is one where Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh is talking about what he called the 3 essentials of Zen practice. And for me, because of where I come from with my experience of Buddhism, I'm not looking at it as the essentials of Zen practice, but really the essentials of Buddhist practice, period. I really do think that these are the things he's talking about are things that are important to all of us, regardless of what, let's say, particular flavor of Buddhism is the one that we enjoy the most. And so I think back to when this book was written in 1975, in a time when Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh was still very much looking at this American landscape of the mid 1970s and kind of making sense of all these Westerners that were coming through the doors, not only of IBMC, but even the classes he was teaching at a university nearby. I want to say UCLA, but I could be wrong. And he was teaching to Westerners who were very young, a lot of them college students, just brimming with excitement, wanting to understand Buddhism, enjoying the novelty and perhaps the exoticism of it. And what's interesting is reading his words, coming across his bemusement at it all, just sort of wondering, like, it's so interesting the way they're approaching this, the way they try to understand this, and perhaps the way that they don't understand it, and the way they don't really stick around to see the results. And I think that that's what inspired him to even write about these essentials in the first place. He says at the very beginning of this chapter that the interest in Zen Buddhism is increasing rapidly in the United States and other Western countries, especially among the young people. But while many are drawn to Zen at the beginning, not many follow through to the end. Why is this? Because their interest was not built upon a secure foundation. Lacking a secure foundation, many give up their pursuit of Zen halfway. Their interest becomes merely inquisitive. It comes and it goes, easy in, easy out, like changing clothes. In order to persist in the path of Zen, it is necessary at the outset to know and to cultivate the three essentials of Zen practice. And then I'll start getting into those in a moment. But listening to his words, I mean, this is someone who was writing on these concerns in American Buddhism in 1975. And what he wrote, I feel, is something that could have been written yesterday, could have been written today, just in terms of the sometimes casual way that we can sort of dabble into a spiritual tradition, a spiritual experience, look at it as simply an experience, and then kind of get a taste of it for a little bit and go, all right, yeah, this seems that was cool, and then move on to the next thing, and then not really seeing the benefits of what a path has to offer. So I can imagine that Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, much like many of us here today, we sit here and we have the door open, and some people come and then some people go, and it can seem a bit like a revolving door. Some people don't come back, and we can ask ourselves why. And I do think that what Thich Nhat Hanh is saying, or is going to say here, is a bit about that. The kind of attitude with which we come to a spiritual practice, whatever that spiritual practice may be. But in this lens of looking at Buddhism, how do we approach Buddhism? Do we approach it as simply, a curiosity? Do we approach it as a bit of exoticism, or simply as a philosophy with fun talking points that we can bring up in discussion at a coffee shop or something? Or do we really see it as a life path, something transformative, something that can really make a huge impact in our hearts and in the hearts of those around us? So the essentials that Thich Nhat Hanh thought are as important act as a foundation. And that first foundation that he wants to talk about is what he calls the first step is great faith. He gives the Japanese for this, the Daishin Kon. I think it's interesting that for all of these, he gives the Japanese term, despite himself being a Vietnamese monk. I think even in that time in the 70s, he was pretty aware of just how interested Americans were in Zen Buddhism, but how they viewed Zen Buddhism as like a strictly Japanese practice. And so I think a lot of them came expecting stuff to be in Japanese. And so he has a lot of Japanese in the book. But yes, this first essential thing, this quality that we bring to our practice is great faith. Now, Thich Nhat Hanh tried to be sensitive to the fact that Westerners, in leaving perhaps the religions of their birth, the religions of their childhood, and coming to something like Buddhism, would be perhaps a bit trepidatious around faith, and look at faith in terms of faith in something external to themselves, faith in a savior, essentially, faith in perhaps a deity who's going to be their shelter, their protection, to be their sort of guard, but also their source of what is good and what is holy and what is pure. the source of like perhaps all their gifts and blessings, let's say. And so Thich Nhat Hanh wanted to make clear that when he was talking about faith, he wasn't talking about faith in an external source. He was very much talking about faith really ultimately in oneself. And he talks about this in terms of its internal quality, where faith in other religious traditions is externally focused, but faith in Buddhism is internally focused. And for the most part, I agree. When we talk about faith in Buddhism, in my tradition, we talk about it in terms of saddha. You know, it does translate as faith, but it also translates as confidence or conviction, let's say. And there is actually, in my tradition, an external side to this faith, in the sense that we look to the Buddha as someone who really figured something out and really achieved something, that through his acts, he really did become liberated, unbound, free, that he did become a Buddha, an arahant. He became someone noble, someone worth aspiring to be like, which gets to that other side of saddha. It gets to that other side of faith, conviction, confidence, which is having that faith in ourselves, the same faith that Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh is talking about. Realizing that within ourselves, we have a potential to achieve what the Buddha achieved. To not look at the Buddha in terms of his path as a bodhisattva in the years and lifetimes, but years within his own lifetime as Siddhartha Gautama. Look at that as something supernatural, super normal, unachievable, but rather to see it as in that sense of here's someone who really put in the work, really tried to come to true knowledge and true vision of what release is, and then actually become released, become unbound, to become liberated, to become enlightened. And I love the part where Thich Nhat Hanh talks about exactly that issue. He says that this path that we're on calls for relentless work, a long and difficult struggle within ourselves. Because it's difficulty, many people who begin abandon the way. Therefore, there are not many Buddhas in the world. This is why faith is so necessary. The first and most important thing is that we believe in our own latent capacity, that we believe in the seed of enlightenment within us, and that we do not abandon this faith no matter how many obstacles, internal or external, we meet on the way. Can we believe that we have the potential to become a Buddha? Why not? The Buddha was just a man like us. He had red blood and salty tears. His body and mind were not so very different from our own. Before his enlightenment, he had passions, worries, conflicts, and doubts. But through meditation, he cultivated himself and discovered his Buddha nature, thereby becoming a Buddha or enlightened one. We also, with all our problems, with all our weaknesses, with all our barriers, have the potential to become Buddhas. And so, Thich Nhat Hanh, speaking as a Mahayana Buddhist, is referring to Buddha nature and one becoming a Buddha. And in these different traditions, we'll often use different words and sort of have the same idea. Me coming from the forest tradition, I wouldn't talk about Buddha nature, but we would still be talking about the same potential to become awakened. We wouldn't say becoming a Buddha, because a Buddha in my tradition, the forest tradition, simply means someone who becomes an arahant in a time when there are no other arahants, and basically had to rediscover the path themselves, which is what makes the Buddha a Buddha. He was able in his lifetime, in a time when the Dharma had been forgotten, to rediscover the path and see it to its end and become awakened. And so he's what we call a Buddha. But in terms of what he attained, it's the same attainment that he and all of his disciples had. There are passages in the Pali Canon where the Buddha basically says that he himself is an arahant, and all of his students who have achieved the goal are arahants, and that's just what it means to be awakened. Mahayana has slightly different definitions on that issue. But when we talk about potentials, we're talking about the same potentials. the same potentials to be liberated. And having that confidence or conviction in ourselves is fundamental to the path. It is an essential part of the path, because otherwise it does become difficult to keep practicing, to keep cultivating, to keep doing this every single day of our lives without that sense of purpose, to have a sense of why we're doing it in the first place. Without that strong sense of why, and that strong belief in yourself, it might be hard to wake up at, say, 4:30 or 5:30 in the morning to sit in the cold and meditate, if that's what you end up doing. I know some people might wait later in the day. But that push out of the bed, a lot of things can motivate us to do that. But faith can be a great motivator in that way. Confidence, conviction can be a great motivator in that way. To get those feet off the bed and onto the ground and get moving, because you really believe in yourself. You believe that not only the path itself is one that transforms, that helps us cultivate, but that we ourselves can be cultivated, that we have great potential in us, in our hearts and in our minds. So faith becomes, as said here by Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, an essential part of the path. Now, the second essential one, he calls great doubt. And I think the use of the word doubt is a bit odd for me. I know that in Zen Buddhism, I've heard a lot of people talk about great doubt, and translating that in different ways as well, perhaps talking about it in terms of like not knowing. And that being a kind of admirable quality, to not know anything, and to be like very skeptical. And some people take it another route and decide to be like very scientific, like everything's experimental and everything's a theory and stuff like that. And yeah, that phrase though, great doubt, I do admit to struggling with, because in my tradition, doubt is actually seen as a hindrance. When we go through the list of hindrances, one of them is vichikicha, right? It's translated as doubt or uncertainty, and that in itself is actually a hindrance to development. So weird that we would use the word doubt, but I think doubt in this case just comes from perhaps the way Zen was translated into English. And Thich Nhat Hanh, being someone who learned English sort of after the fact, just took that term on as well, because he makes a point of saying that he's not talking about doubt in that perhaps negative sense, the sense that would be what we would call a hindrance. He says here, so the second step along the way of Zen is to inquire and to doubt everything until it is checked out. This second step is very helpful. Too much skepticism is not good at all. But there is skepticism and there is skepticism. There's a kind of skepticism which is rooted in a narrow mental outlook, which refuses to believe anything and takes a cynical delight in maintaining an attitude of negativity. And there is the healthy kind of skepticism, the skepticism which is a stepping stone on the road to deeper understanding. If we follow the first kind of skepticism, then we will doubt our own inner potentiality and our own capacity to attain the goal, as well as the efficacy of the practices which are designed to lead us to this goal. This kind of skepticism leads only to a dead end. But if we follow the broader kind of skepticism, keeping the mind open and critically examining things to determine whether they are right or wrong, that can be very helpful. So I think when he says here, critically examining, we're talking about what I would call not doubt, but actually something that is one of the 7 factors for awakening, Dhamma Vichaya, Vichaya being investigation. So that kind of curiosity, that investigative mind is something that I guess we could translate as doubt, but I think it's better to look at this, yes, in terms of investigation. one way of looking at this that comes from the forest tradition is that when you're practicing the path, you're sort of tasked with, they say this playfully, it's sort of like something to drive you to practice, which is try to prove the Buddha wrong, which sounds like a wild thing. It's one of those one lines that a forest monk will drop, and it makes everyone like, what? And really what it means to try to prove the Buddha wrong is that, okay, the Buddha lays out the Four Noble Truths and the corresponding tasks, duties with them, one of them being to develop the Eightfold Path. And the Buddha says that developing the Eightfold Path to its end is what leads to liberation, right? What leads to Nibbana. So trying to prove the Buddha wrong doesn't mean that on a philosophical level, you just come up with better or more convincing arguments, probably more convincing arguments, more tempting arguments, because that happens a lot. But actually putting it all into practice, it's sort of like a reverse psychological move, you know? It's like, well, prove them wrong then. Go ahead and spend every day cultivating the path, work on right speech, work on right livelihood, work on right view, and sit in meditation and like, all right, see if you prove them wrong. And it can be a funny tactic, because what it ends up doing is getting someone to practice more diligently until that perhaps that sort of doggedness gives way to something more pure, let's say. And one of my teachers points out that early on, sometimes spite is okay if it's a motivation to practice. You see someone over there sitting a little better than you, they look calm and serene. You're like, well, I can do it. I can be like them. I'll sit too, and and sort of force it, if you will. And then eventually, it's not something that's forced. It's a funny thing the way we play with the minds, with our mind rather. It's something that we think we're going to go in a direct way, and sometimes we have to really combat an issue from the side, from an angle. And there are playful ways of doing that. And investigation becomes one way of doing precisely that, which is rather than giving in to the sort of doubt that would be a hindrance, because when we actually translate vicikicca, it can not only mean doubt, in terms of practice, it can mean hesitance. And I think that's a useful way to look at this, not just in terms of sort of the mental aspect of doubt, where we have a lot of questions and we have a lot of uncertainty, and that kind of gives us really muddy goals in terms of the practice. But that what doubts end up leading to is hesitance. What that means is non-action. And the path that we develop as Buddhists is a path of action. And so we can see why hesitance, something that leads to inaction, is completely detrimental to the path. But investigation is useful, because it means that not only do we have that kind of curiosity in trying to understand the path in terms of right view, but that means that same investigation becomes an internal process, because then we're analyzing the qualities of the mind, the qualities of the body, understanding this process that we have going on, these processes that we have going on. That's what leads to not just right view, but what ends up leading to wisdom, discernment. We have to investigate ourselves. That's part of what we're doing here, is as meditators, when we sit down to meditate, we're not just simply sitting around enjoying a good feeling, but using whatever feelings arise, good or bad, to understand ourselves, to come to true wisdom. And yeah, that is a quality that one might say is a kind of scientific experimental quality, something like that. But in my tradition, we refer to it as investigation. And so that's when I read Thich work, I look at it from that angle. So now we come to the third essential part of the path, which is great determination. And this part, I think, is one of the ones that he thought was not necessarily the most important, but certainly the one that maybe he thought Westerners were lacking. And this is me purely speculating just based off of what he wrote. He says here, it is generally very difficult for Western people to practice without looking for immediate results. When I was in Japan this past summer, a famous Zen master told me that recently 2 Western men had been studying Zen meditation under him. One stayed 6 months, one a year. Both of them expected shortcuts, and both wanted graduations when they left. The master explained to them, the way of Zen is not the way of a university. We do not set apart a certain period of time for study and then receive a graduation. The way of Zen is not a matter of months or years, but of a lifetime. Perhaps you may consider me a master, but I consider myself a student and still study and practice every day. And then Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh says, Western men are almost always in a hurry. When they come to Zen, they practice very hard at the beginning, but when they do not get quick results, they quit. So we must not expect shortcuts. If we look for shortcuts, we will not endure. So great determination, to me, sounds like, in Pali we call it vidya, which gets translated as energy, but it can also mean persistence. And persistence has a lot of similar qualities to determination. So in this path, we're not only looking to be determined, we're looking to be persistent. And that has a quality of energy to it. There's a reason why vidya is translated as energy. But I think persistence is useful when looking at what he was describing here, the kind of person who expects immediate results and who expects shortcuts and who expects a lot of kind of laurels for just sort of initially starting out on the path. And persistence as a quality can help us temper that and recognize that what we're doing, something that takes time, something that the Buddha called a gradual path. That's what he called this path we're developing. He called it a gradual one. And something that in the beginning works almost invisibly. A lot of the changes are small and imperceptible, but they are there. They are absolutely there. The Buddha called this path something that was good and admirable in the beginning and in the middle and in the end. Meaning that all along the path, there are fruits to be enjoyed. Not necessarily the fruits of Nibbana, the fruits of awakening. Those happen at later stages, but even at the beginning, there are fruits to enjoy. There are things that we're getting from the practice. But it's also important to recognize that what we get from the practice corresponds to what we give to it, which is why we need to be determined, why we need to be persistent, which means that we take this faith and confidence in ourselves and what we can develop, and we take this quality of investigation and we marry them together in ourselves. That we have faith that these potentials exist, and we investigate to see where the potentials are and cultivate them. And we do this with a determined attitude. We use this path of action with great effort, great persistence. So those are the 3 essentials of Zen practice as described by Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh. Me reading those as a Theravada Buddhist, I also see them as essential. The qualities he's talking about are things that I see in other parts of the Pali Canon, other parts of Theravada teachings, other parts of the practice, in my own practice, seeing the importance of faith, seeing the importance of investigation, seeing the importance of persistence as foundational, as bedrock, as not just qualities that we need to have in mind, essentially we need to have in mind at the beginning of the path, but all throughout the path. Because these are part of the raft that we use to get to the other shore. Every part of the raft is important, because we take any parts of the raft away, the structural integrity starts to fall away, and the raft breaks up beneath us, and we get lost in the water. So with that in mind, we have this raft. We're trying to get to the further shore. It's a path of action. So hopefully what I've shared today is motivation that encourages us all to act. I can't tell you how many discourses in the Pali Canon, and with the Buddha giving some great discourse and then reminding everyone there what it's for. He says, hey, look, there's a tree, there's an empty building, go sit and meditate, go cultivate, go practice. So it's a good reminder, I think, for all of us today. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Subodha. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask from Subodha. Since it's the time for Q&As. Anyone who has any questions from the audience?
Or a comment. It could be from you guys
Yeah.
as well. I know I was going to ask you about the whale watching trip you went on. We'll talk later.
Hi, I have a question.
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My Buddhist name is Reverend Thich Nhat Hanh, but I go by Mira, which is my American name. Venerable Karuna Dharma ordained me at the temple. I affiliated since, well, the first ordination was in 1994. So I guess I started coming in 1990. And she was ordained by Tianan. It was at UCLA that she met him, and he was teaching there. He had left Vietnam because of the Vietnam War, and was teaching Buddhism at UCLA, and she was a student there with an elective to fill, and took one class with him and ended up becoming a Buddhist, the first American Buddhist nun. And he and the two basically founded the temple, and she became the abbess after he passed away. She used to take us to his gravesite, and we watched, and I'm sure there's somewhere, but she would have a television set up, and we would watch his talks and listen to them. So we heard directly from him. The way, so much of what you said was really fantastic. Such a, good and grounded interpretation and personal, obviously. I remember, Tianan talking about great faith, great doubt, and great perseverance, as opposed to persistence. And the idea was, the same in a sense, that it's long-term. When I think of persistence, I think of like persistence of vision, where our eyes, our brains are constantly, reloading an image. And perseverance, I think of as just, there's a road ahead, there's a raft and a body of water we need to cross it, and it's just a flow, as opposed to committing. It's a vow, like the vows that I took. They're flexible, but at the same time they're immutable. And I actually read the other day something I hadn't studied before, which I sometimes find unusual, because I feel like, I've read so much and I've listened to so many, I studied with Thich Nhat Hanh, who was a Dharma brother of Tianan's. They studied together at university, and both, went out into the world, as the Buddha said, to, enlighten others, when he sent his monks out into the world, to decrease suffering and create happiness where they go, which I think is really key, because,
Mira, can I step in just before we get lost in it? Because
sure,
you brought up something that I think is a very good point. It might have actually been my own mistake in talking about persistence rather than perseverance, because I tend to agree with you. I think I sometimes conflate or confuse persistence and perseverance. And I think you have a great way you defined the difference. In fact, it might have actually been perseverance that I had meant in terms of determination. So
Right.
I'm glad that you were saying that Venerable Thich also used perseverance when talking about great determination.
Right.
I really do hope that the recordings of him still exist somewhere. That's something I didn't know existed at all, and I wonder who has perhaps kept any of his sort of audiovisual teachings around for those to enjoy. Because as I was discussing today, like that's part of his legacy and part of history that hopefully will continue onward. I was
Right.
talking in terms of recent history that I was glad to hear we're honored and respected in the past, and I hope that's something that we can continue.
I think Bhante, Ratnasara should know where they are if they still exist, but I would think they do. They were on, if I remember correctly, it was pre-DVD. I think they're on VHS, but still,
Oof.
but still,
It's hard to find anyone who has a DVD player these
well,
days.
you can
VHS.
find them. They're cheap now. But the last thing I wanted to say is something that I hadn't heard, put this way before. And it goes to what you were saying also, that the Buddha's last words were strive on untiringly. It wasn't, the promise of enlightenment. It wasn't, don't worry, if I'm gone, you'll still be at peace with the teachings. It was kind of not a command, but he was furthering the direction, the path, in his last moments. He was saying, continue untiringly, which is, really, to me, poignant, because, we think of him as not reincarnated, because we don't use that word in Buddhism, but, in a rebirth that the sole purpose was for him, as you were saying, to pick up the mantle of, he was born noble as a prince, but the nobility, like he said, you're noble if you understand reality. That was the Buddha's definition of noble. So I think, this idea of striving on untiringly, it's, for me, it's very poignant, because I've been doing it for a comparatively short amount of time, given the length that Buddhism has been around, the amount of time, 3,500 years. But for my lifetime, 35 years of studying, or almost 40, I guess, is really significant. And I miss IBMC when I'm not here, and I'm actually really grateful for virtual, the virtual Zendo, basically, because it means so much to me just to see the Buddha sitting there and the monks, as always, on the mat. So thanks again for your talk, and for, spurring me on to, and one last thing, great doubt was, yes, initially great doubt, great faith in yourself, but more, what Tianan used to say is, it's great faith in the Dharma, that you have to have great faith, and then doubt, because don't take anything. Even the Buddha said, don't trust what I say. Practice what I practice, and judge for yourself. As you were saying, you said it in terms of prove the Buddha wrong, but even the Buddha was like, I'm just a finger pointing at the moon. Don't come to me. Look where my finger is pointing. That's where you want to go. That I'm pointing at the truth. So don't worship me. So it was always great faith in the path, great doubt in terms of teachers or people who say, oh, I know what it is to be enlightened, or, have great doubt about, question the truth versus anything that comes up to question the truth. And then, great perseverance that once you found it, to stay with it and to strive on untiringly.
Thank you, Mira.
Thank you.
All right, now I think it's time for us to finish the
message for you to say. Thank you, Subodha, for the wonderful Dhamma talk. It is very good subject and with a lot of information.
Thank you, Nan.
yeah, before we're gonna finish the Sunday service, I would like to add another comment for the Dhamma talk. You gave a wonderful and a brilliant, amazing Dhamma talk, Subodha, and I also do agree with, I think, Reverend Mira. Yes, and at most of the time, what we're doing is you are comparing and contrasting the Dhamma factors. For instance, the great doubt, and when it comes to English, and we have to find the better terms and translations to understand. It's a wonderful quality, and it's the beauty of studying Buddhism. And you did it today. It's really fantastic, because every time whenever we are going to the other traditions and comparing and contrasting and to see the similarities and dissimilarities, it's a wonderful way to study Buddhism. Thank you so much for your again and again for your splendid, wonderful, great Dhamma sharing today. And with that comment, we would like to start the chanting now. We are going to chant the page 4 and page 10. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang saranang gacchami. Dhammang saranang gacchami. Sanghang saranang gacchami. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to save them all. Deluding passions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them all. Dharma gates are limitless. I vow to study them all. Buddha's way is supreme. I vow to attain it. May suffering ones be suffering free, and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving shed all grief, and the sick find health relief. Name ye Guru Sangha Bhogat Naidan Du Chân Sanghe Gai Gong Thái Bà Đạo. When ye should come to Phật Nhai Đằng Du Chân Sanghe Gai Gong
Thai Pada. When ye công phổ cập nhai rằng đủ trong sanh con Thái Phật. Om Mani Padme Hum. Thank you so much, Venerable Chandasara, for leading the meditation session. Many thanks and many blessings to you, Stephen Subodha, for being the Dhamma speaker today and sharing your wonderful Dhamma knowledge with us. Thank you, Venerable Ratan Sar, and thank you, our friend, for participating in person. He is here in person to participate in this Dhamma sharing. And thanks to everyone who are in the Zoom and who are online listening to this Dhamma sharing. And many blessings to every one of you. Thank you again and again. And with this, we finish the Dhamma Sunday service, Dhamma sharing. Thank you so much, and stay healthy. Much peace to you. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.